Okay.
Oh, finally. About the third attempt.
Yeah.
Anyway, nice to meet you, buddy. Is it cold where you are? Because we're
Not
coming into
yet.
summer here.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's like early fall, so it's still like 20 degrees or something during the day. So
Right.
it's okay.
Yeah, Melbourne's. Oh, it's warming up. The next couple of weeks it'll warm up, but
Yeah.
unfortunately we don't want to say too much about it because of the censorship. But a lot of the cities in Melbourne, sorry, in Australia is locked down. But anyway, so people have got a
Yeah.
lot of spare time. So anyway, um, it's all right, I found the show notes now because I wasn't quite ready and I haven't had a shave. But
Yeah.
just for the people that don't know you in Australia, uh, just introduce yourself and tell us about your background in RC, and
Yeah.
then tell us about what you've got planned for next season on your YouTube channel from the ground up.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm Max Mer from Finland. Uh, I raced for. I started 2008 with 10 scale during the winter, and then straight on to 8 scale in the summer. So I raced for a long time, and pretty much I raced 1 year with X-Ray, and from then on I raced with JQ because then he
Right.
released the car. And since then I ran JQ until 2019 when I left for Team Associated. More personally of my career, uh, I've I've been pretty I've been racing a lot for a long time. We since like 2011 we've been going abroad to races and traveling around Europe, especially with Joseph from 2016 onwards. We did like 1 month, 2 month travels. Well, basically my summer holidays were always we took a car ride down to Europe with Joseph and then just raced and practiced everywhere and tested new stuff. So yeah, that's been sort of my RC career, uh, shortly said. And about the series from the ground up, which is my YouTube series, uh, the second season most likely will be sort of more topics because I barely scraped sort of the top with the first season. So
Wow.
more of those topics and sort of like more aspects of car tuning in sort of the same idea. And I really want to do something sort of to prove because right now all my videos are often just the theory and then I say examples on the track. So I kind of
Right.
want to make the second season so that I have some material to prove that what I'm saying actually happens. Let's say a slow motion video or whatever it is. I want to have that more. So yeah, I don't know when I will like have the second season out or start to properly do it because right now I just started school, so it's been sort of a change of plans for me a bit. But
Right.
I think my plan is to try to make it over the winter as racing is a little bit less, so I have more time for making videos and on the side of school instead of in the summertime it's been like work and then to the track or like work and then renting on cars or whatever. So it's been a lot less time to make videos.
Right. And when you say school, just briefly, what's going on there? When you mean
Okay, so
school, you mean college or university or?
yeah, I just started this week in Lappeenranta University for mechanical engineering.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Now, we'll get on with the questions because, oh boy, have I got some questions for you. I normally, and then we've got a couple of quiz questions at the end,
Okay.
which are interesting. So, anyway, so we'll have some simple questions and then we'll get into, uh, we're going to get into some of the serious stuff. So, the first question is why do young, talented RC drivers plateau?
Okay, so yeah, this is a really common thing that happens. For me personally, I I think I had like smaller plateaus, but I never had like big plateau where I just wasn't making any progress for a year or so. So I never had this issue personally, and there's a few reasons why this happens. The probably the biggest one, and for most people, which applies, is when people turn like 16 in America, they get a car so they can hang out with their friends more. Here, people start drinking at like 16, having like more
Agree.
social meetings. So it's just that like people start to have much more of a social life, but much more stuff comes into life at that point. And then like if they sort of race until like they're like 18 or 19 and they have that plateau in RC because they haven't put that much effort into it, then they have to like decide to go to work or to school, and then they just eventually quit. So I think that's the biggest thing. It's just that life starts to be a thing in
Yeah.
young drivers' lives. But in terms of if they are actually trying to pursue RC and still plateau, there's there's obviously a lot of things that can happen. But from what I can see is one thing that really sort of detrimental to young racers is if they don't have a really knowledgeable mechanic, or if let's say their dad has been their mechanic but their dad isn't that into it, they just want to hang around, they don't really like get into setup or wrenching or whatever, they
Hmm.
and the driver or young driver doesn't want to or isn't interested in wrenching or testing or whatever themselves. It's just that they just don't have the equipment on the level that it should be. It's not that it
You've
could
got
be
it.
that.
You've got it. That's
Yeah,
the answer.
yeah,
Because let me just let's talk about Melbourne because I'm familiar with the Melbourne electric off-road racing. The guys, the young guys um, that are good, that their father is the wrencher. So yeah,
hmm,
you've got it absolutely correct. But
yeah,
I totally agree with what you just said of all them things. But you've definitely got it on that last one. It's
yeah,
definitely a major factor. That's why I want to try and I've got a little guy, he's 5, just over 5. But I want to try and improve my skills when it comes to setting up the buggies. But anyway,
yeah.
go on, carry on. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you are
Oh yeah, no,
absolutely
no,
spot
yeah,
on.
yeah.
The
That's why,
father,
yeah,
the
but
mechanic,
mhm,
because as you know, little young guys are just, I'm not, saying, speaking about them, but, they're less inclined to wrench on the car and to put it's just too much information for them when they're
yeah,
young. That you can't even you get guys that are older. They, if they come into the sport and they don't improve, well, from my experience, what I've seen anyway, if they don't improve, new people over the next 2 months, um, and people they're not helped and they don't improve, your chances of losing them, they'll just put the buggy on marketplace on FB and sell it, and you've
yeah,
lost them.
yeah,
So
yeah.
anyway, sorry to interrupt. Carry on.
Yeah, so for me, I personally started wrenching on my own cars when I was, let's say, 13, 14. So I
Wow,
sort
that's
of,
the key.
I, yeah, so for
That's
me,
why that's
the
why
fact that I
you're
was,
where you are now. That's one of
yeah,
the
so for
I
me,
believe that's one of the reasons.
yeah, that's sort of like, that's where I sort of took the initiative because I was really interested in RC and I really wanted to pursue RC. Like, obviously, I went to school and all other young kid stuff, but I really was interested in putting a lot of effort into it, and I felt it was really fun as well. So, uh,
Mm,
starting to even just like not thinking about setup or thinking about anything, just thinking about wrenching helps a lot because sometimes
mm,
you go out on the track and the car feels bad, and then you do something in the pits and you see like, oh, that was much better. So next time you go to a race, even though you don't know anything about setup, you just know that one thing that might help you at the race.
correct.
And the more things
Yeah.
you know, it just keeps on growing, and that makes your life a lot easier. But obviously, if you have a dad that's really, or just a mechanic for you who knows what they're doing, it's obviously
Mm,
much better that way. But a lot of people don't have that.
yeah. I mean, let's just talk about Melbourne. I mean, we've got two in our club, Keylor. We've got two guys, Ray and Simon. who, I mean, if you were going to ask them for setup advice or, you know, to repair the car, you would, you know, them two people would stand out in my mind. There's also, they're actively racing now in Melbourne, but there's also a guy, Matt, who's not, he's on a long break at the moment. He's renowned for knowledge of setup of car, and he's actually a multiple Australian national champion in 1/10 electric, and I think he's won 1/8 buggy, Matt Griffin, but he's just renowned for knowledge of setup. But he's on a long break now. But I mean, I'm not taking anything away from anybody else in Australia. There's certainly a lot of other people with a lot of knowledge, but in Melbourne, definitely them three people are by far superior when it comes to knowledge and setup. Anyway, let's get on with these questions. Now, this one's interesting. When you're in a final fighting for the win, do you talk to yourself in your head? What exactly goes on? Let's, and I forgot to congratulate you on your Finnish national
Oh, yeah.
1/8 buggy. Yeah, so congratulations. So when you were fighting for the win, okay, what was going through your head, you know, them last 10 minutes, you know, 15 minutes, or let's say, you know, in electric, 5 minutes feels like an hour.
Yeah.
You know, when you're out front. So what goes on in your head?
Yeah, so it really depends on the situation a lot. I believe a lot of people don't really think about anything, they just drive. But for me, at least, I always think a lot about what I'm doing when I'm driving and sort of that. But when I'm like out front and there's like a huge gap, all I just try to do is stay out of the pipes. Just like keep the car in the line, like nothing too aggressive, and just take it sort of like take the 10% off, and always like try to look for cars if they crashed in front. Just trying to like manage the race till the end. But then it gets sort of it gets much more difficult when there's someone like, let's say, 5 to 10 seconds behind, because you can't really crash, but you still have to keep your pace up. So that's when you really have to be like, you have to always sort of know what the gap is. You have to, I personally just always try to just do my laps. So I pick sort of the speed I want to go and then just do that and try to do that. I try to get into a rhythm which I like, and then sort of staying sort of aware where you are in your pit window, because a lot of times in nitro especially, the engine goes a lot leaner at the end of the tank. So if you pushed early on in a tank and the engine heats up a bit, and then it starts to go a bit leaner because of the less fuel in the tank as well, it just it makes it even worse when the engine is hot. So a lot of times, if you just get too excited at the early parts of the tank, you're gonna get screwed at the end if you don't sort of you don't think that it's gonna go lean the engine. So that's a big part of nitro racing, is understanding where your engine is so that there's no surprises. Because if your engine goes just a tad bit lean and there's, let's say, an off camber or a tricky jump, you're really going to get surprised when the engine doesn't match your throttle inputs. So that's sort of most things I think about. For 10 scale, I just always try to do my laps. No matter where I am in a race, I don't really, it's too short to sort of make any crazy sort of management decisions. It's just like you just do your laps, and then just obviously need to pick a plan at the start. So let's say if you're in a pack, you need to think that, do I really want to get by these people now, or do I just follow? But that's also depends if the front end is like starting to go away. So if the front end of the grid is starting to pull away, then you just have to make the pass and try to make it stick. And that's probably the most things, like making a decision, what's my plan for the remainder of the race. Because sometimes, for example, if you're, let's say, electric, and there's 3 finals, you don't always need to win every final. Like sometimes second is good enough. So like that's all the decisions you need to think about. And I always think about what I do in the mains. And I'm pretty always, like, let's say for electric especially, I'm always aware of the points, because a lot of times you can win with a 1 and a 3 for 10 scale. So if I know
Correct.
that no one else has, or the guy leading has a 4, and I already have 1 and a 3, I don't need to be I don't need to be too crazy with him, because I know like he can't win like this. So that's always a good thing as well, because a lot of times I hear people just go crazy on track and they make some stupid mistakes because they're pushing too hard, because they were trying to catch someone who wouldn't have even won them in the points. So those are the things mainly to think about, really, what I think about during
That
races.
that was leading on to my next question. But because we have obviously people, the world around, but in Melbourne, that race, I've got a friend, he's got bloody electric. He's just bought a 1/5. He races nitro. Now he's into on road. But just for the nitro guys, with your vast experience with the engine leaning out, can you just explain when when the tank goes low on fuel? But can you just explain for the nitro guys when the air filter gets dirty, how it affects the engine?
Yeah, so that's one thing as well. That always is to some effect as well. It depends if it gets. I'd say the air filter isn't that big of a thing. But the biggest thing about the air filter is the idle. So if you set your idle a little bit too low, you're
Right.
gonna have to be really careful to not stall the engine. Otherwise, drivability and due to the air filter isn't that big. But one big thing that sort of combines with the air filter is the temperature, because oftentimes the main is the last final of the day, obviously. So it's always quite late, and always at night the moisture sets in, and it always gets a bit colder, and the sun starts to go down. So
So that
all
you're
of these
talking about
things
the air now,
together,
aren't you?
yeah.
You're talking about
So
the air gets more moisture,
yeah, so
right?
all of
Because
that sort of together.
they won't. I mean, I can understand, but because I've raced nitro for 5.5 years.
Yeah.
So if you raced all day and it was getting dark, because this is an interesting question, and we'll get deeper into. If you're racing, let's talk nitro for a minute. Let's have a bash for the nitro guys, and then they put the floodlights on, and you were racing during the night, and it was colder, and the air was colder. What would you have to do to the engine? If
It
would you have to richen it?
uh a lot of times, it feels like you have to reach in it, but then when you go on track, it gets really rich for some reason. So a lot of times in the pits, like the engine feels good, and it's like, okay, it's perfect, it's been good all day, and then the main is
Yeah,
colder, and you go out and warm up, and the engine is really rich. So a lot of times I've had to lean it, like thinking of it like if it's colder air, it means there's more sort of oxygen in it. So it
correct.
like you should basically need to reach in the engine, but because of the cold weather, I think that cools down the engine a lot more. And our engines sort of need to be at the sort of the, let's say, 110 or 105 or 120, whatever like the temperature is, but for your engine. But that's sort of the biggest thing, trying to keep the engine temps sort of really stable throughout the main. And you really want to
Right.
shoot for that tune, because for a qualifier, you can tune your engine really lean and you'll be fine for 5 minutes. But then when it's 45 or on vice versa, really rich, but then you get really bad mileage in the main, or at the end of the main, your air filter goes really dirty, or the air gets colder, your engine starts to go richer
Mm,
because it cools down, and it doesn't get hot anymore, and you don't have the power anymore. So sort of that's
mm.
probably the biggest thing, sort of knowing what's going to happen throughout the main, sort of temperature and air wise, and then planning for that.
Right. Well, I mean, I haven't raced nitro for a while, and I don't think I will. I'm too old now. I'm 50 now, so just one more thing on that, which leads on to this question. Let's talk about electric. Go back to electric for a minute now, because it's probably a different mindset. Now, let's say you won the first final, and then you're sitting third or fourth in the second final, and the people in front of you are pulling away from you, but the guy in front of you, you believe you can overtake, but you're going to run out of time. What do you do? Do you settle for the third or fourth, or do you potentially have a go at trying to overtake him? But you're running out of time. You know, there's 2 minutes left. What would you do?
For me, it really depends, because I often race differently with different drivers. Just because I know how people race, especially obviously if you're racing against people you don't know,
That's a good point.
I would often then probably go for the overtake, because like I don't have any idea of them. For, let's say, people I know, oftentimes I know like some people, like I know like this guy is really risky to overtake, then I might not go for it. And obviously that's sort of a bit a bad attitude in the end, because like that guy gets away with it. But sometimes, like, I'd say fourth, if you're in fourth place, probably you would have to overtake if you want to fight for the win, because you really need at least a 3 to really properly fight for the win. So that stage, I would obviously go for it, but it also affects what's happening behind you. If you have a huge gap, you always go for the overtake no matter what, especially in electric, because there's, like in nitro, there's a risk of flaming out, but in electric, there's really no risks apart from like getting like stuck into him and losing some time. But if there's someone really close by, let's say fourth is a lot better than sixth. Like sixth is you do nothing with that, but fourth you can do something with it. So that's also something you need to calculate there. But personally, I often try for an overtake, but in situations like that, I take it really carefully. Because there's lots of different styles to overtake. You can overtake like you know you can fit in there, but something can happen. And then there's overtakes where you just try to trick the other person to do a mistake, and then you go by. So
that is another good point, where you can pressure the driver in front to make a mistake. You can that is another very good point. But anyway, let's get on to
there's like tricks.
Go on.
If you like shoot for the inside a bit, or then just take a different line some laps and sort of try to confuse the driver in front, that always helps a lot. It's actually pretty easy to do it that way.
Yeah, confuse the driver. What a good point. But like you say, if you know the driver, then it's difficult. But if you go to I have been to an international electric race in Taiwan, and a couple of times actually. But anyway, let's get on with these questions. What's a week like for you before a big race? And do you have a practice buggy?
Yes, right at this point, I don't have a practice car, but I have practice front and rear ends. So I just take the front and rear ends off and put it on. But always, like beforehand, I've had a practice car. Now there's not much running because I don't have a local track. So I haven't had a practice buggy separately. But yeah, if you have a chance, and I'd say it's probably even cheaper, even if you buy everything, to have a practice buggy, because you only put the new stuff into the race buggy, and you don't have to worry about the practice buggy as much. Obviously, you want to keep it in the level where it feels similar to a race car, but you don't have to be so sort of everything needs to be always perfect with the practice buggy.
Tricked out,
yeah. For a big race, oftentimes I always try. Let's say the race starts in like Thursday, Friday. I always try to get practice in the weekend before, because if there's more than a week break, it starts to be too much. So I always want to have the week before of practice. At least I try to keep it that way. Then, like after that, usually it's just wrenching, getting ready for the race. Some people I've heard like to prepare 2 cars, so they prepare their practice car and their race car. I generally just have a race car and 1 engine. Sometimes I've had 2, but generally just get the car ready. I always tear the car down like completely before a race, and oftentimes just for practice as well. Just to know like there's nothing broken and everything is sort of fits together and there's nothing bent. That's also a big thing. Like a lot
Oh,
of
massive.
I've seen a lot of fast drivers who go to a race and then like halfway through like qualifying or whatever they see that they have a bent like shock shaft or whatever, and you're like, come on,
Mm,
like how is that possible?
mm. Well, we got to go back, to mid 2000, well, probably, yeah, mid 2000s. Matt Francis, uh, the Team Losi, famous driver from way back, had a very famous saying. It was called the 5 Ps. Proper preparation prevents poor performance.
Yeah.
So I mean, he for maybe 2 or 3 years, because I was a big fan of his. He did dominate the world of 1/10 electric, and was very famous. But he doesn't race today, actually. But that was his motto. Um,
Yeah.
but Adam Drake is also a big one on preparation, as you well know. But anyway, let's get on with the next question. Watching earlier heats, what should drivers look out for before their run?
Oh yeah, actually, yeah, this is
Let's
I
electric or nitro, electric or nitro.
yeah, it's pretty similar for both. Generally, you just want to watch for spots that people crash a lot in, or spots that have some like line people take. Like that's sort of from earlier heats, it's hard to take sort of lines and stuff because they're just like the earlier heats are usually so the lowest ranked drivers. So from those, it's generally just watching like if there's sort of a bump building on the track, if some jump phase is getting worse, sort of like something to catch you off guard. But a lot of times, especially at like Euros, where they do it in a way that like the top guys are divided into three heats. So I always try to look every single heat and try to look for lines people take and ways people drive. Some like pretty much just look at how other people drive just to know like okay I can do that or I can improve there, and that's I think that's really important as well. There's a lot
Mm,
of like times where I've looked at another driver and then afterwards realized okay I can go faster there, I can be faster around the lap, and especially like some tracks have it that you can run it really aggressively and be fast or run it really smooth. Let's say it's really low grip tracks, you can like sort of go inside and drive really nice, or then just like flat out roost it out and go to the banks
mm,
and jump the jumps along. And a lot of times, uh, for me, it has been easier to do the track in the style where you don't have to like push too much. So you can sort of go the shortest lines and really drive really nicely, but still keep a lot of corner speed so that the lap time is very similar, or in my case, oftentimes faster than going aggressively. And
mm.
sometimes, like you drive some corners too aggressive, and you see someone else is driving really nice and be really fast. And that's one of the things that is really easy to spot, and you don't even have to watch too long. You can watch a few laps and you get it. So those
Right.
are like you can easily find a tenth or two just by watching someone else drive.
Yeah. What about when the traction changes? Um, and what about if you? I mean, in in electric in Australia, because the cities are quite far apart, and obviously with the current situation in the world. But even before, we don't really travel a lot. Some people do state championships and nationals. Nationals is, you get the creme of the creme turn up, and state championships, typically everybody comes out the woodwork, the locals. But so, but what you do, uh, what advice have you got for the young guy? Because see, if people understand, as you well know, I don't have to tell you this, if people understand and gain knowledge on how to adjust the car for different conditions, this, they can go from track to track, be more consistent. It's more fun and enjoyable. So that's the goal really of this video. I should have really said that at the start, but anyway. So what's your advice for young people? You know, when they're at a track and the traction goes up, and even they think, oh, I can do that jump better, or the traction's up now. What type of things should they do or adjust the car? What advice have you got for these young drivers?
Oftentimes, there are some like simple things that you do. You go to maybe a thicker shock oil or thicker springs. That's something like really basic, works for every car. But a lot of times I sort of try to make my setup in practice so that each track I go to, I go out and run my basic setup, and then
Right.
immediately after running 5 minutes, I already know the things I need to do. So when you sort of, every time you go out on track, you test the things, and
Can I just put
only
in
test
there?
the,
Can I just?
yeah.
Is that because the buggy feels lazy or it's slow? Because you know people are going to. Some of the young guys who maybe watch this in the future, because we'll put it on YouTube. They're not on your level. They haven't done as
Yeah.
much racing as you. You know. So what you actually mean by that? You know, is the car lazy, or what do you actually specifically look for? What gives you the
Yeah.
feedback? That's the question. What gives
Okay.
you the feedback from the buggy?
Okay, yeah, that's actually a good question. Like, especially if I go to a high group track, I
Right.
always look for like, is the steering really hard? Because obviously, a lot of times on higher grip, the car starts to sort of not oversteer, but the front end is way too aggressive into the corners. So that's sort of what I'm looking for every time I go on track. So let's say I go to a high
Right.
group track as we're doing now. I see like if there's corners where I have to be really careful with the steering. Uh, After that, I already know, okay, so I need maybe a thicker front spring or a thicker front shock oil, or even sometimes you would go to a different piston setup. That's sort of like the first sort of thing you need to figure out, what's the piston setup for this track. And then on, I like, to be honest, for this year, I have not changed a single
Can I
thing
just
in the
step in
front end
there
of
for
the
a minute?
car. Yeah,
Can I just butt in for a minute? Because you've made a good point. But if no matter if it's electric or nitro, we're talking buggies now, or trucks,
yeah,
whatever, two-wheel drive, whatever. Okay, we just explained it. If the car oversteer, if you've got too much EPA on your wheel radio, because I mean,
yeah,
you know, I race sticks because I'm obviously English from. I started in the UK back in '98 with a Mar Dave Cobra, so, and then moved to Australia basically. So if you've got too much steering throw, so EPA, you know, steering, as when you steer, okay, you know, and then when the tires come back straight, as they're coming back straight, it grips. We just want to make this a point. It
yeah,
grips, and then you get the oversteer effect.
yeah,
So, you know, one of the things there that people can do. I'm not disagreeing with what you said, but one of the things they can do is make sure that if you know, turn your steering EPA down so it's not, you know, oversteering. So as the tires come back and straighten up, as you well know, Max, you get more contact patch on the ground, so you get more
yeah,
traction, and then you get the oversteer effect. So, but I totally agree with what you're saying. But anyway,
yeah.
because we've only got through 5 questions, we've been talking nearly half an hour. Can you explain the importance of? I mean, this is an easy one. Can you explain the importance of air bleeding your shocks during a race? You know, we're talking about temperature changes now. Um, so can you just explain, give us your opinion?
Yeah, so for me,
Well, electric or nitro, it's the same. It's the
yeah,
same.
for emotion shocks, uh, I really rarely do anything like to them because they're really easy to maintain. You just build them once and then you change the shock oil when it wears out, really.
That's what Adam
With
Drake
ladders,
says. Yeah.
Yeah, for bladders, it's a bit more tricky, but also bleeding them is a bit tricky as well. So personally, I just try to sort of check them that they're okay. That's always
Right.
what I do. And then if some shock is like way too much pressure in them or whatever, then obviously I need to rebuild it. But I
Hold on,
generally,
hold on, hold on. Just because some young guys who won't understand the mechanics behind that. Can you just go in? Why? Why would you have to get the air out of shock, and why would you? Why? Go into the mechanics of it,
yeah.
because they
So
won't know, Max. They're not
yeah.
on your
So
level.
the
It's true. I
for,
swear to
for
God, they won't.
so
You'll get some
for the
13-year-old kid watch this in the future, and he won't have a clue. You've got to explain the mechanics behind it, the actual
yeah.
mechanism of why. Why do we bleed the shock? Explain.
Yeah, so the reason to sort of have the shock without air is if you have a bladder shock and there's a lot of pressure in the built up inside the shock, especially nitro, even in electric you can like feel this, but especially nitro, you go on the track, run, let's say 5 to 10 minutes, and the car just gets worse and worse. And oftentimes what happens is people use too thin shock coils and then they build their shock so that there's a lot of pressure in them, and it feels okay in the start, but then the shock coils get even softer and the pressure starts to build up. So the car is really like springy, and it feels like there's no grip, and it also feels like every bounce is much bigger. So
Yeah.
the, like beating your shocks wrong is really sort of a really big issue the longer you drive, especially. And for me, that's why every like a lot of people just build their shocks like really quickly. They just put oil in, like screw it in. I personally, what I like to do is every time I build my shocks, I try to make it as perfect as I can straight away. Because when you build them so that there's like almost no air, because it's impossible to get no air, but when it's as close as possible to no air, it's it stays better for a much longer time. You don't have to worry about it during the race or whatever. But when you build it so that there's a lot of air in there, it can change during the day even, or and especially it
Mm.
changes when you drive it during the race. So that's why I personally I've I've done it so that I've also like bleed the shocks like middle of the day during a race, but I've since then started to do it so that I put a lot of effort when I build the shocks so that they would stay better for a longer time, and I think that has worked
Mm.
out the best for me.
Yeah, I mean, look, my experience, it just feels more into the track. It kind of, especially with
Yeah,
electric, if you don't get the air out of it, it's
yeah,
just like you say, it's not as much traction, and it just
yeah.
feels weird. It doesn't
Yeah,
feel.
it's yeah, it
Um,
feels like springy a lot. Like it's sort of
mm.
like there's just a spring. There's not a shock absorber.
Well, as you know, if you add rebound into a shock, it pushes the tire back to the ground quicker. But
Yeah,
I mean, that doesn't work in electric.
yeah,
100% of the time, it doesn't work in electric. Um, I've even tried it on. I mean, I raced in Perth on a fairly low grip track, and we used to race Friday night under lights, but it just didn't work. You have to.
yeah,
I've got the Tamiya, the Tamiya, the long, the pump, and it's just brilliant.
yeah.
Anyway, let's get on with these questions. Um, now we're getting a bit. Now we're getting a bit complicated. Um, too, too thick a sway bar. Now, this was one of the things I got from your video. Too
Yeah.
thick a sway bar, too thick of sway bar will exceed the grip of the surface. Can you explain that, please?
Okay, so this sort of all links up together. So a too thick of a spring or a too high of a roll center will do the same thing. But sway bar is part of the sort of uh, well, it's part of the suspension. So when the car body starts to roll in a corner, a thicker sway bar will make it so that there's less. So well, there needs to be more force through the suspension so that the car will roll. So when the car
Right.
would start to roll, instead of rolling, it starts to push the tire to the ground. and you can sort of see if you push the tire to the ground like straight down, obviously it has grip. But this, when the body rolls, it pushes it sideways. So when you have too much force on the tire sideways, you obviously start to lose grip. You exceed sort of the friction of the tire. So you can imagine sort of you can push a box on the ground, but if the box had wheels on its side and they sort of the box could move a bit before you like it's like it can move a bit before well, it could roll a bit before it starts to move. You sort of
Right.
you have a sort of absorption of the force before, and then you can push on a tire. But if you have a really thick sway bar, what happens? You don't have that sort of give in the start. Well, you have it, but you have less of it. So you have less give of the start and more force directly to the tire once your body car body starts to roll, and that way there's too much force too suddenly, and you exceed sort of the friction level. That's why always when you see
Right.
those friction sort of lines,
Can
it
I
always
can I
goes,
just make can I just make that point, because you just said a lot of information, but there was one key point in there. So too thick of sway bar puts too much, is it pressure or force onto the tire?
yeah, either way I think works. Well, force or pressure,
Okay,
both.
so it puts too much weight, basically.
Yeah,
So too thick a sway bar puts too much weight onto the outside tire. Is that correct?
yeah,
Okay, and it exceeds the grip.
yeah. But this also happens if you have a very thick spring or a very high roll center. The forces around the A arm does the same thing. So they put a lot of force to the outer tire and don't let the car roll. So basically, I think I watched Ray Monday's one video this week. Actually, one of my friends sent it to me, and he talked about just this. And basically, the way I like to explain it is, if you have no suspension at all, everything is directly to the tire. All we are trying to do with the suspension is delay the initial force to the tire. So we're trying to delay it so that we could put as much pressure on the tire without exceeding sort of the grip limit. So if you look at sort of the tire, like the
So
friction
hold on,
grip, it
hold
goes
on.
up, and then sort of goes
Yeah,
down when you exceed the tip. So you want to reach this point, sort of the top of the friction, like putting pressure on the tire before it has that drop and you lose grip. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to delay it so that we reach just the top of the grip before top of the friction before we lose sort of, and we go into sliding friction,
right.
which is much less.
Let me just tell you about an experience I had with my four wheel. This is my. Sorry. Let me just tell you about an experience I had with my electric four-wheel drive. Luckily, our president of the club was there, Simon, and he suggested I put a thinner sway bar on the front. So in the front of the rostrum at our local club, Keilor, there's like a hairpin U-turn, and it's fairly high speed. We take it tight, and our track's got a lot of forward bite and just slightly less side bite, which works out well. It's an oil track with basically canola oil on there. But what was happening as I was coming out that turn? Okay, let's get this right. So so the inside tire, which has got the load on, but I was picking up the outside tire, was waving at me.
Yeah.
So anyway, I mentioned it to Simon, and he said, put a lighter sway bar on, and then I added some drooping to the front, because I was a bit scared of adding in droop, thinking it would roll more. But as you know, adding in droop, okay, keeps more of this outside tire onto the ground. So so as the car rolled into the corner, more of that tire that was lifting up was on the ground, because I had more droop into the car. with a lighter sway bar, actually got rid of 95% of the problem. Was fixed just by changing them two. So as it cornered, you know, I wasn't picking up that outside tire. So I, you know, it was a win-win situation. But
sway bar is actually, a lot of people don't understand at all what the sway bar does, like the principle of it, or then just like don't put enough effort into like knowing what to do with the sway bar, because oftentimes a lot of things can be fixed, especially on a track where there's not a lot of bumps and it's sort of you're driving, especially in 10 scale actually, because 10 scale really rarely has bumps. So on tracks like that, sway bar can be a really good tool to sort of adjust the balance really easily. And as I already sort of said, the shocks and the springs and the sway bar and the roll center all work sort of together. And the sway bar is the easiest thing to sort of make a quick change, because you immediately know what it does. You put a thicker sway bar, it puts a little bit more force in the outer tire, and you put a thinner one, it puts a little bit less. So it's sort of a fine-tuning thing. And and one thing oftentimes what happens is people put a thicker sway bar in the front, and then they think like the car is gonna turn less because of that. But oftentimes your car can actually have more steering with a thicker sway bar, and that's because you don't initially have enough force on the outer tire. When you put a thicker sway bar, you start to reach sort of the tip of the friction, as I said. So you start to reach it more, and you have actually more steering and more grip that way. And that's basically like everything you're doing with an RC car. You're trying to put the maximum amount of force on the tire without it being like too much. So you're trying to load the tire as much as possible at all times without it losing grip at any point. That's basically the fastest way to go on the track, because it's moving a weight around the track, and the only thing supporting it is the tires. So that's sort of what we need to think when we're going into sort of the theory of how to set up a car. And that's like sort of the baseline of everything.
Just one more thing about springs. We had a bit of a quiz question today on the truck group. A stiffer spring will keep the car flatter. What's your opinion on that?
It depends. It needs to be balanced with the shock absorber, and that's one thing as well. A lot of times you can have more aggressive car with the thicker spring if your shock coil is really soft. But sometimes if your shock coil is really thick, having a thicker spring, a lot of times will keep the car a bit stiffer. I would still not say flatter, because let's say roll bar keeps the car a bit more flat. For the spring, it's oftentimes just it moves sort of less under roll, but it doesn't really affect the flatness of the car. It just affects sort of, imagine if the car rolls like this. So
so the load transfer.
The load transfer to the outside is still like you have the same thickness of a spring each side of the car. So it doesn't affect roll thickness as much as anti-roll bar affects like directly. So it's really hard to say sort of what's flatter and what's what, but with a thicker spring, the car is obviously a bit more direct. So you don't have that, you don't have as much delay on the roll. The roll is more sort of sudden, and it doesn't roll as far, and it has the maximum sort of roll earlier on. And that's probably the biggest thing about springs, is just controlling sort of how far the car rolls and where it rolls. Especially a lot of times I've noticed that balancing out spring versus sway bar is really important. Last time I was practicing for the final race this year, I went to a softer sway bar and tried that way, and it was better. It has a little bit more grip. The rear end was a bit more under control. But then I went to a softer spring and went back to the thicker sway bar, and I had sort of, the roll was very similar, but I had much more grip because my car would squat more. So sometimes you want to sort of find if you need more squatting in the car or diving in the car, or do you need
Mm.
more roll in the car? And that way you decide between going to a thicker spring or a thicker sway bar or stiffer spring.
That's a good point. That's a good
Yeah.
point. I did have another question. Anyway, let's get on with this. Hold on. Because, true. Oh, here we go. The buggy on bad landings. What's your experience? Have you had any bearings go? Whether it's nitro or electric?
Like bad, like jump landings, having
Yeah,
bearings go
yeah.
out.
If
Well, definitely, the car definitely doesn't like bad landings, and that's why I often sort of wonder. Some people like to over jumps all the time and have a flat landing, and that's just one thing. Sort of as we talked about earlier on about like race management. That's a big part about race management is knowing like what is breaking your car. For me, bad landings on bearings obviously it hurts them, but it's not like the biggest thing. In electric, it's
mm,
just like the speedo, motor, battery. Like flat landings always hurts them. And in nitro, it's really easy to stall the car that way. If you hit it very hard, you can have a flame out. And
right,
obviously, servos are really on much stress when you have flat landings. And that's yeah. I personally always try to jump to the landing if possible. Some jumps don't obviously have landings, but it's it's really not good practice to jump to the flat always. There's
no,
sometimes you need to do it, but if you can avoid it, you should always avoid it.
yeah. Today, um, well, there was a video online of Ryan Cavalieri landing his 22.4. So because there's a big race at
Yeah,
OCRC.
Surf City or something.
Correct.
Or
Yeah, that's probably the best track they've ever built. There's going to be a brilliant race.
yeah,
So he's done that. He's done that double, and then he's quadded and
yeah,
landed. He's landed like kind of the bottom end of the down ramp, but he landed very slightly wheels first, and then it just was just perfect. But I mean, what's your advice on landing, whether it's a four-wheel drive, two-wheel drive? I mean, I believe front wheels first is beneficial. What have you got to say about that?
uh, it depends. In two-wheel drive, it's sometimes better to land rear first, just because you have a lot of times you have a lot of group in the rear. So in four-wheel drive and in eight
Hold
trail,
on, hold on.
oftentimes,
Can we just make a point there? Um, because you're absolutely correct, but they won't know the answer. Okay.
yeah,
When the car lands, if you've got more droop, the tires touch the ground first, or
yeah,
earlier is the word. It
yeah,
touches the ground earlier, which basically, because they won't know, Mac. They're not on. Remember, they're not on your level. You've got to explain the mechanics of it.
yeah,
Because they just won't know. They won't. Honestly, some 14-year-old kid's not going to watch this if he's not going to learn anything. But you are absolutely correct, whether it's two-wheel drive, whatever, trucks, four-wheel drive, nitro. But anyway, carry on. Go on. Sorry to interrupt you.
yeah. So yeah, and as you said there, one thing like to point out is I always sort of want to know what my car can do, because with two-wheel drive, as I said, it's sometimes better to land rear first than front first. But
Correct.
then other cars, it might be different. So also you need to sort of know the best way to land your car. And oftentimes it's sometimes better to land a bit on the side. It sounds a bit weird, but sometimes it's better to land a bit on the side so the other side tires catch the ground first, and then when those shocks bottom out, the shocks on the other side haven't bottomed out yet, so they have still some compression left. That way,
Right.
you sort of compress the shocks first before you touch the chassis to the ground. If you land really flat like this, it's always like a chassis flap and the car just bounces straight up. That's why You need
Correct.
to have it at some angle, front end first, rear end first, or sometimes to the
Totally
side is
agree.
also good. So,
Totally
and it
agree.
depends on your car, it depends on your shock angles, and a lot. Obviously, shock oils and pistons affect this a lot as well. But you need to sort of, especially if there's a jump to the flat at some track, you really need to know what's the best way to land it for your car and do that every lap, because you can't just expect it to land like you just jump it and then something happens in landing. You can't do that. You'll crash there at some point, or then you just lose time over a run. So that's something that if you have to do a flat landing, you can really maximize the speed there, and also you can with the least amount of sort of chassis slapping the ground, you also save your car a bit. So that's
Correct.
that's really
Totally
important,
agree.
and you can win a lot of time as well doing that.
Right. Now, now this is, I got this from one of your videos on from the ground up, your YouTube channel. And I've got something to add into this about trucks, because two-wheel drive electric trucks are slightly different.
Yeah,
You have said putting weight into a buggy is the last resort. But
yeah,
before you answer that, let me just, I mean, this is based on, I mean, I'm no, professional driver, but based on my experience with a two-wheel drive electric off-road truck, a 1/10 one. Well, as in buggies in general, what trucks you need, even in the US, they run the brass C.
yeah,
Because what happens is with the trucks, because they're a bit high, but it's even with the two-wheel drives as well. If you ain't got enough weight in it, it just slides. So
yeah,
it won't go from point to point, because it's just not, it just doesn't feel planted. It just hasn't got enough weight to be, So with the two-wheel drive trucks, you need to add the more weight. When I got the truck a few years ago, the T6.1, everybody was at a big race and it got rained out, but I got halfway there and drove back to Melbourne, went to our local track, and there was only a few people there. So anyway, and it was a bit damp. So I ended up putting loads of weight in the truck, and it just got better and better and better, and I just left it there. So the trucks and the buggies, I mean, like I say, I'm no expert, but if you ain't got enough weight in the car in general, if the track's low grip, it won't drive from point to point. It just slides. So
yeah,
the problem is now our track is now higher grip. Some of us have gone to the LCG batteries because after round 2 and 3, the traction's there. So you don't need as much weight, and it jumps and lands way better. So, but anyway,
yeah.
going back to the question, you said putting weight in a car in general is the last resort. So what's your opinion?
Yeah, so the reason sort of why I said that is, as I said earlier here, we have the tires and we have the body, which is the weight of the car. And there's a level of the grip of the tires that you add pressure to it and the grip grows and grows, or the friction grows and grows until it's the maximum, and
Correct.
then it goes down again. So
Correct.
if you don't have enough weight in the car and you can't transfer that onto the tire, you never achieve the maximum point. So you're just somewhere
Correct.
here where you never get enough pressure on the tire where you can have the grip. And
Absolutely correct.
one thing often what happens is when it's really low grip, people go to thinner diff oils and they go to thinner springs and stuff. But what really they need to do is have thicker springs. They need to have maybe even thicker diff oils, just so that they get as much pressure on the tires as possible on that grip level of a track.
Hold on,
Sometimes
hold on,
it
hold
just
on, hold on, hold on. Can you, because that's the first time I've ever heard about the thicker diff puts more weight on the tires. Can you go into that a little bit more? Because
well
that's
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 well
first time
that's
I've ever heard that.
well that's sort of well, it doesn't put sort of on the roll, it doesn't put more weight to the tires. What it does is when it's really sort of low grip, what happens is the
Yeah.
inner wheel, if it's too thin of a diff, the inner wheel starts to spin, especially in 10 scale because there's so much
Correct.
power. So that way, when
Absolutely.
the inner wheel spins, you start to lose sort of force on the tires. When you have thicker diff oils, you have sort of the car letting its roll. It allows the car to roll more naturally. And then when you go in power, the diff running like the inside tire running is not going to unsettle the car as much. So that's
Correct.
probably the main thing about that. It doesn't really
Absolutely.
add force the same way as, let's say, a spring would add, but it really helps the car roll more naturally. Because a lot of times when it's super low grip, people go to like 5,000 or even lower than that in four-wheel drive and outdoors. And what they end up doing is they just end up like running the inside tire and not having any drive out of the corners, and still the grip they gain from that is not really significant.
Can I just make a point? Let's talk about, because this is what we used to. This is the characteristics we used to get on our old track. Our old track was good, but it wasn't oiled, so it was, you know, it was hard packed, dusty. But I just want to make the point for the guys or the young guys or the people who watch this in the future. If you're on a dustier track, and like you say, the diff's loose. Let's talk about a ball diff now. Let's say you're coming out of a dusty corner and the car wants to do this, okay? Or you can't put the power down. It's because it spins that inside wheel. So you'll get this effect, or, you know, you won't be able to, you know, you'll be waiting to pull throttle. If they do up the ball diff a little bit, don't over tighten it, because they can flatten the balls, which is not good. If what happens is you'll get more direct drive out of the corner. You, like you say, you won't get that inside wheel spinning, so it won't be doing this business.
Yeah. And I mean, especially on lower grip, a lot of times what you want is for the car to do what you're trying to make it to do. So you want the car to be as sort of precise as possible, so you can drive the shortest lines. Because if you set up the car where it's really soft, you have to push it and slide it and drive it really aggressively to be fast.
It's too lazy.
What I always like to do, so what I always like to do is make the car really sort of precise and follow my directions, because there's no sort of ruts to catch the car, of course, like they would be on high grip tracks, where you really want to make the car a bit more lazy so that you can avoid the bumps a bit more. And on lower grip, oftentimes you just want to make the car really sort of direct. And that way, when you have the setup on, like you have to set up properly on the grip level you're on, you can start to take that weight off the car. So that's what I sort of meant, circling back to the why weight is the last resort, is because a lot of times, let's say you're racing or practicing, and you feel like your car, you just don't get enough sort of force on the tire, and you add weight to the car, you get more force to it. It can be better that way, and it most likely for trucks this actually probably is the case, because the tires are bigger, which means that you can add more pressure to the tire. Instead of like 10 scale tires, which are much smaller, there's a smaller contact patch, which means you can't add that much pressure before you are in the maximum point. With a bigger tire, you have a bigger contact patch, so you need to have a heavier car or need to have more force to the tire. But that's pretty much what I said, because about the weight, is because you can have a setup in the car that can add that same effect as the weight would do. It would just be a lighter car, but you can have the roll going in a way that you add more pressure to the tire. The only issue with this is it's much more, let's say your car is really, really light, it's much harder to get the setup just perfect. So that's the issue.
Hold on. Can I just jump in there? Because I just want to explain again, if the car's too light, especially in electric, it just slides.
Yeah.
It's just a fact. You know, it won't drive from point to point. It just on a low grip track. I mean, our track it will still slide a little bit, but you don't get that. You don't see so much. But just on that point, because that's a very good point about getting the maximum, going to that maximum weight on the tire before you exceed the grip, and then you'll start losing traction. as I think Ray's pointed out in some of his videos before.
Yeah.
Can you give your point of because if you if you raise the car up, as in your springs, so if you raise your ride height up, you put more weight on the springs. So what's your opinion on that? What I mean, if there's what I'm talking about is unsprung weight, which what's your opinion?
Yeah, so generally raising the ride height or having, let's say, sort of, because a lot of times when you raise the ride height, some springs become really compressed under the ride height. So a lot of times what happens is the first movement of the car is much more direct if you have a stiffer spring. If you have a really, really soft spring, it just makes the car move around a lot more. But if you have a rather stiff spring and you raise the ride height, the car starts to be a bit more direct. It starts to roll sort of on the ground instead of being like really. It's kind of hard to explain, but maybe this is the best way to say it. Like when you have a lower ride height,
it feels real.
Sort of, yeah, it feels like when you have a low ride height, the car rolls sort of in the ground a bit. But when you raise the car, it starts to float a bit more, and you have sort of more preciseness in the car. It doesn't catch ruts as much, and it's a bit more floaty, but you get the preciseness off of that because you don't have the car rolling like in the ground and being a bit too soft. And also one thing that often happens is our roll centers a lot of times are under the ground, which makes the car roll in a bit weird way. So it doesn't roll sort of, instead of rolling down like this, it rolls a bit up like this. So it rolls like sort of up first and then down. So that's one thing as well. Oftentimes, if your roll center is just tiny bit below the ground and you raise the ride height, obviously it raises the roll center as well, which makes the car roll very differently. And that's why a lot of times you can be at the track.
Just explain, hold on, Max. Just explain that. Go into the mechanics of that. So if you raise the car, the ride height, it raises because obviously the center of mass is high. Just explain that because people just won't know. They're not on your level. They're not.
Yeah. So basically, it means that if you raise the ride height, it's basically the same thing as if you would raise the arm and the link from the inside, if you think about it. And you also raise the center of mass, but there's a big difference when the roll center is above ground, because that's the point where the force is sort of pushing the center of mass when you are going around the corner, or the hinge of sort of the force, which I think I said in my video. Roll center, if you think of it, the roll center is below the ground, which is the hinge of the roll. If you push, when the tire pushes on the ground and the hinge of the roll is below the tire, it doesn't allow the car to roll down like this. When it's above ground, it allows the car to roll downwards into the tire instead of sort of rolling around the hinge and then into the tire, which would happen when the roll center is too low. And when you raise the ride height, it changes the angle of the lower arm and the upper arm, or the upper link, which makes it so that now the roll center is at the point where it rolls directly to the ground. And this way, the car can feel a lot more sort of, how would you say, natural to drive. It doesn't have that weird move up effect, which sometimes is good. Like for higher grip tracks, you need to a lot of times have the roll center below ground to get enough sort of drivability or over like bumps. Because if you have the car roll like this and there's a bump, it's obviously going to catch the bump much easier. But if you have the car rolling a bit like this and then rolling down, you can avoid the bumps, because when you start to roll, it's going up instead of going to the tire. And the higher the roll center is, the more it rolls to the tire, and it starts to sort of, this motion gets less, but the sideways motion gets more and more. And that's probably
right, because that's a lot of information. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's. We were going to go in. My next question was about camber game, but we won't go into that because we're going to go off. We'll stay where we are now. Now,
yeah,
because what you've just said will go over most people's head, so we got to go simplify it a little bit.
yeah,
Can you explain? So when we're talking links now, let's talk
yeah,
link position because people understand link position. You know, all that stuff you've just said is just first-hand nature for you.
yeah,
Let's talk about links. So when you raise the link, okay, you have explained in one of your videos, it causes the roll to be slower. But when
yes,
you raise the link, it actually pulls the car down.
yes.
Can you explain that?
So yeah, so if you think of
Because
the upper
they
link
will
being like this,
understand this.
yeah. So if you think
So
like
if
these
you
are the
raise the
upper links of the car, and you
hold
go
on,
into a corner and
because
the
that's a lower
car,
link with.
well,
Let's talk
okay,
about a.
upper links.
Let's
So
do
upper
this
links,
link. Yeah, upper link.
yeah, upper links are like this. So when the car starts to roll
Because it
in the
put.
corner, the car rolls, so the links go like this. They don't go like this because the tires are very similar angles all the time. They have one or few degrees changes, but the car rolls. The links go like this. So when the other
Yeah.
link is sort of at this much of an angle, and the tire wants to go this way because the grip is affecting from the bottom of the tire, and it wants to like go this
Correct.
way when you're with the outside tire. What happens
Hold on,
is,
hold on, whoa, hold on. Because hold on, you've got to explain it to him, Max. Because once the tire goes like that, you'll lose the contact patch on the ground.
well, that too, but
Correct?
also yes, yes, but also
Because
the biggest
they
thing here
don't
is
know.
just the,
They won't know.
yeah, but just the fact that the ground is sort of pushing on the tire this way, so the tire, even though it doesn't move, it's pushing the tire still. And what happens is the tire starts to pull this link. So
Oh,
the
so
more angle you
the bottom of
have,
the top.
the
Go on.
more angle you have on the link, the tire
Yeah.
starts to pull it more. So if you have the upper links really, really low, when the car rolls, it's a crazy angle on the link, and it starts to pull the car up when you're mid corner in like the deep end of the corner, and this what causes a lot of the grip rolling, especially in 10 scale. So that's
So
why when you have the links, let's say you have the
if
links
the
like
links are
up
like
like this.
this, it lifts the car up.
Yeah, so immediately it goes like, so if you go to a corner, it starts to do this, but when there's more and
Yeah.
more force on the tire as the ground pushes it from here, and it wants to do this, it starts to pull the car up. So the car goes into the corner like this, and when it has more force in the tire, it either comes up like this and loses grip, or what happens is it goes like this, and then you grip roll and lose the grip. And that's why if you have the upper links, you can have it like this, or like most of the times it's still pointing downwards. But let's pretend that the upper links are sort of at this angle. And when you
Okay.
roll, it's not as bad. So if you roll and the car rolls like this, the upper links are a sensible angle, and if it pulls, it just pulls the car downwards. So this is
Ah.
this is the
Oh. Well, that's
simplest
good.
way. Yeah. So now if you're on a higher grip track, you have the links like this, and you go into a corner, and you want the car to sort of go deep in the corner and still like have a soft feel. So when you go like this, instead of pulling the car up and pulling it sort of trying to flip over, having the links upwards will make it, the car will just pull downwards. So as I said before, the car will do something like this, and then it will pull the car downwards. Instead of with
Right.
a really high roll center, meaning your links are like this, upper links, you will be pushed into the outside first, and then you will exceed
The
the
car
grip of the
lifts up.
tire, or the car lifts up, or you flip, or whatever. And this is the very basic roll center tuning, is the upper link. That this is very sort of simple and easy to try at the track. Just to,
Correct.
especially this is like in the rear. This is the biggest, like this is what I change the most, the rear link height. If I go to high grip track, I immediately know, I just raise it like one hole, and now I know this works, because that's all I need. I need to match what the car wants to, how much the car puts force on a tire under roll, match that to how much friction is on the ground. And when I know sort of my basic setup of the car, I just adjust this with the upper link. Sometimes if there's too much difference in the grip level, I have to do other things. But a lot of times the grip level at different track is very similar. So let's say for the last national series we had this year, I from track to track, I switched the rear link position and rear springs pretty much. That's the only setup changes I made almost all year, because I have the basic setup set, and then I just know like what I need from the rear end to have the car be on the grip, sort of try to reach the grip limit. And that's one thing that roll setter is really good with, because you can change sort of how fast the car rolls, and that's what we're trying to match there. And the whole thing about a car like first going up and then down with the links up is delaying the moment of where there's maximum pressure on the tire. Because if your car goes directly like this,
hold on,
whoa,
hold on. That is a key point.
Yeah,
that is so key on adjusting your roll center. We've got to we've got to understand. So adjusting it actually delays or speeds up the pressure or weight onto the tire. So, is that correct?
Yes, exactly. And that's the biggest
difference. Because they will understand that. It's got, Max, it's got to be as simple as that. You know, they haven't been around, you know, I mean, you know, I always say that the 1%, the drivers that do the most racing are what I call the 1% in the world. You know, they're very difficult to beat because they do the most racing and they've got the most knowledge. Now, we've got to stay on this. Can you explain why, when you lower the link, so you have a higher roll center, because let me just explain to the people, you've got to think counterintuitive. So if you lower the link, you raise the roll center. But can you explain why, when you lower the link, so you raise the roll center, because it's counterintuitive, why is it when you getting out of a corner, you've got more grip? Can you explain why? So if you got a high link and you lower it, but when you're coming out of a corner with a low link, for some reason, you've got more drive, more grip out. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so a lot of times, especially if you're coming out of a corner and you have the links, so that you have the links that way as you're pointing downwards, and roll center is higher as well. The car is a bit stiffer, so the car has already rolled and is sort of coming back to the stable ride height. So
that's key.
Instead of being like, if you have a really low roll center, means the movement back will always be slow as well, not as directly as movement in, but with the links downwards, the car will be stiffer geometrically, not the springs or the shocks. The geometry of the car is stiffer, which means that even if the shocks are a bit bottomed out or the springs are already a bit compressed, the geometry is still like pushing the car. And a lot of times, for example, in the front, you can make, like, lowering the link, you can have much more sort of turning in the car because the front geometry is stiffer, but you can run softer springs, for example. So this is one thing as well. A lot of times you can tune the stiffness of the car, like geometry versus sort of spring stiffness. And this is exactly, you see this with exiting corners with the links downwards. The geometry of the car is stiff, which makes it work even though it's rolling already. And if you put a stiffer spring, what happens is the force goes directly to the tire and it starts to sort of exceed the grip more instead of just making the car a bit stiffer. It's similar to anti-roll bars. With anti-roll bars, if you have a stiffer anti-roll bar, you can actually have a bit more exiting grip at some points.
Right. Right, we got a bit lost with this show notes, so we'll try and let's have a look, because we've jumped right forward. So we got roll centers. Center of gravity is a centrifugal force that applies to act on all objects. So we're talking about the center of gravity. Can you just explain that?
Center of gravity car in aspect of if you want to tune it, or in what way?
Just explain what it is. So that the
Okay,
center of gravity, the centrifugal force. So that is just explain that.
Yeah. So each car, like a lot of times, people sort of tune the front and rear ends differently because they sort of think front and rear end, but in reality, there's a point in the car which all mass is sort of centered around. So that's sort of the center point of the car, which is center of gravity. And actually, every time you corner, that's the point which the car would start to pull itself. So that's why, for example, changing to a lower battery will make the car roll a bit less, because it will lower the center of gravity, and
absolutely correct.
It will be so that the car will be pulled from a lower point. And this is actually a very key thing that people should know about their cars. How sort of, they don't obviously have to know exactly where it is, but to know somewhat that, for example, between if they switch cars to another brand, some cars have a much higher center of gravity, and the same things might not work on that car. That's because the center of gravity is at a different point, and you have to tune the car around that. And that's why having less weight is gonna make the car a bit more harder to tune, because it's much more, you have to be much more precise with how stiff you make the springs and the shocks and the geometry of the car, instead of if you have a really heavy car and you can tune the car almost any way and you will have very little effect. And the center of gravity,
that's interesting.
Yeah, the center of gravity affects the car much more than you would think, and that's why I personally have wanted to try to make the car as low of center of gravity as I can, and then try to lose as much weight just to get sort of get the car as light as possible and have the car itself roll really fast, and then I can make the geometry of the car roll slower, as we talked before about the speed of the roll with different roll center adjustments.
That's, yeah, because that's what they'll understand, because as I say, they're not on your level. But just make the point, because like some of us at the track now, we're buying the LCG batteries to keep the weight low. And I noticed, I watched, just going off this a second, I watched the Dakota Fen, his last FB Live, and he runs LCG in his two-wheel drive, his four-wheel drive, and his truck. Obviously, to keep, it keeps the weight lower, and you get slightly less. Well, we call it weight transfer or load transfer, which is the correct. So a few of us now are moving over to them, but anyway, we'll continue on. Yeah, well, the next one was roll centers in the negative anyway, which you pointed out. If you lower the rear inside link, you get more drive out of corners. We've done that one. So a raised roll center close to the center of gravity, less roll, but hold on, I don't know if I've actually written this right. Raised roll center close to the center of gravity, less roll. So the roll center determines how the centrifugal force is applied to the outside wheel. Can we just go over that?
Yeah. So as I call, the roll center is sort of the hinge which around the car rolls. So you can imagine so that if tires are touching the ground here and roll center is above the ground, sometimes below, but usually a little bit above the ground, and let's say my thumb is the roll center and the centrifugal, the center of gravity is right here. So when the car would start to roll, a force would be applied here, and the car would start to roll like this, and this point would roll around. So this center of gravity will roll around the roll center point. So it wants to go around the roll center point like this, and the closer you have them, the less it's gonna roll. And if they are the same point, there is no roll. So that's if the roll center and the center of gravity are at the same point, the car will just do this. And then the further away they are, the more the body will roll. So if the closer they get, the roll is much less. So that's sort of how it works.
Can I just jump in there?
Tuning.
Because you've just, something's just flashed into my head. Something that's happened when, years ago when I had the roll center too low, the car just didn't roll, and it would just slide for some reason. It just wouldn't. Yeah. It just doesn't work. Anyway, right, because we're getting really, really technical now. Where are we? Once you start to lower the roll center, a higher percentage of force goes through the suspension.
Yes.
So let me just say that again. Once you start to lower the roll center, a higher percentage of force goes through the suspension. So just explain that. I'm just going to get a drink because my lips are like really dry. So go through that, and I'm just going to grab a drink. I'll be back in 1 minute.
Yeah. So basically, just then what I explained was the effect of the roll center and the relationship with the center of gravity. And the lower you have the roll center, the more movement in the body there will be. And when the roll center is really close to the center of gravity, there will be less movement.
So let's just explain. So a lower roll center means a higher link. So if you raise the link, you lower the rolls. You got to explain it to them, because some of the people that'll be interested in this won't. They'll be fairly new. Yeah. If they've been racing 5 or 6 years, they know the basics.
Yeah. So basically, the more movement in the body means the more movement in the shocks. So let's imagine the roll center is super low like this. The body will move a lot, and all of this movement will be transferred onto the tire through the shocks. So the closer there is, the less movement there is, which means that more of the force is transferred through the arms and the links of the car. And that's why if you have the roll center like this, which is basically means that you don't have any suspension on the roll. So the car will be just perfectly stiff on the roll if the roll center and the center of gravity are at the same point. There will be no force going through
the car's stiff.
Yeah.
That's
and the
correct.
more you make it, the more distance between the two, the roll center and the center of gravity, the more movement there will be, which means more sort of force through the shocks. Because shocks and movement work together.
Right. Now we're making some sense now.
Yeah.
Now we're slowly sinking in.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
that's why you can make the car. That's why this is probably a good sort of understanding moment as well. You can make the car not move around at all by making the shocks really hard, really stiff. There's just no springs or no shock or something, just a link there or something. The car won't move at all. But having the roll center at the same point as center of gravity will do the same thing. So when you're tuning your shocks, you're tuning the stiffness and roll movement of the car. But when you're tuning your links, you're doing the same thing. You're just doing in a geometric way instead of doing it in the spring or shock absorber way. And by tuning a stiffer spring is like changing your roll center, sort of, but it's just a different way to do it. And you need to always find the balance between geometry and spring.
Right. Have we got another? So we are. Let me just, because we've gone completely off the show notes. We've gone ahead.
Yeah.
So let's talk about in reality now. We have talked about the links because people won't be on your level and know you've got to think counterintuitive. So we've got to tune your car at the track. So let's talk about in reality. On a very loose track, a lower roll center will give you more grip. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So, but this is also something that.
So that's a
some people
higher
could
link.
say the opposite. Yeah. So that can be the case, but oftentimes the roll center, as I said, goes below the ground. So sometimes if you raise the link
in the negative,
the roll
that's
center,
correct.
Yeah. And if you go there, then you start to lose grip again. So basically,
why?
that's because initially when the car goes to the corner, it wants to roll up like this and then down. So when it's really low grip, you go into a corner and start the car to move. When it goes up, it doesn't build enough pressure on the tire to have grip. And that's why you need the car to roll into the corner so you get the grip to the tire. So even though it's always said that lower roll center will give you more grip, but that's a really sort of you need to take into account the spring stiffness, the shock stiffness, as well as if your roll center goes below the ground into the negative, it really loses your grip a lot because you don't have the force into the tire. You have the force rolling the car up and then into the tire. And in this this phase of the roll, when the car goes up like this, what happens is you already lost the grip of the tire. And that's why if you go too low with the roll center, you will start to lose grip. But then if you go too high with the roll center, you start to lose grip because of the fact that you do this. And when you do this, you lose the grip of the tire already there. So you
does it roll?
Traction.
It rolls slower. Is that what you're saying? With a high link,
yeah,
it rolls
slower. So then when you go too high with the link, it rolls too slow. It never goes to the point where it's pushing enough force under the tire where you have grip. But then when you have too high roll center and the links are, if you have the links too low, what happens is already when the car starts to roll, you already exceed the maximum friction point of the tire and you start to lose grip then. So you need to find the point where the car rolls in the exact sort of way that you push the maximum pressure on the tire early on so that you don't lose grip then, but then keeping it so that there isn't too much pressure where you exceed the grip as well. So that's sort of the balance you are looking at the track every time you go out.
A couple of questions just popped in me. I don't think I think one of them is different surfaces, track surface. We're not talking Astro or EOS carpet. We're talking clay, real racing. Different surfaces like different roll centers. I've only recently, probably the last 4 years, and probably Ray pointed that out. Maybe 2-3 years ago now, different surfaces like different roll centers. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, definitely, and that's just exactly what it is, the tuning of the roll of the car. For example, if you have a really, really dusty track, and even if the grip level is very similar, but if the track is really dusty, you oftentimes want to have the geometry of the car rather soft, but then maybe thicker in the springs or shocks. But when you have the track really polished, you want to have the geometry of the car a bit stiffer, and then the shocks and the springs a bit softer. So that's one thing. Obviously, if the grip level is higher on polished tracks, usually the grip level is really slippery, but sometimes even polished tracks can get really grippy, and then you obviously have to go the stiffer springs and stuff. But when the grip level on the surface is similar, even then if it's a different type of surface, it affects how you tune the car. And that's one good example, just then what I said is, on duster tracks, I often like to go with the thicker spring and a stiffer shock oil, but then with the much sort of looser geometry, and then vice versa for the polished tracks. And that's sort of one really good example where this, what you asked, applies really well. That's just tuning how fast the car rolls and how do you push the car to the ground.
Now, got an interesting question for you. What about if the rear end, we're talking, you know, 2-wheel drive, electric buggy, 4-wheel drive, you know, nitro, truggy, buggy, 1/8. What if the rear end of the buggy is not following the front around the corner?
So it's pushing out, or just pushing the car into the corner? Which way? Oversteering?
It feels like you got too much side bite
in the rear.
The rear's got too.
Yeah. So oftentimes this is the result of too much toe-in. Actually, the toe-in really determines when the front wheel steer. The more toe-in you have, so imagine the car goes around a corner like this, and the rear tires is angled like this. It's always trying to sort of fight against the steering motion of car. If your rear tire is like this and it's going around a corner, there's much less resistance. So toe-in is a really key thing in how the car rotates around the corner. And I
hold on, Max. Can we just make a point that so toe-in, if you got for people that don't know, for the big, beginners, so rear toe-in is when the rear wheels are more in, when you look at the car if the front wheels are at the front of the car and you're looking at the car, the rear wheels are more towed in.
Yeah.
So it causes understeer. Max in the corner, it causes the car to understeer. So Max is going to explain now why that happens. If the wheels are more straight at the back, you've got less towing. So Max is going to explain the characteristic. Can you explain that, please, Max?
Yeah. So just then, actually, what I said already is when you go around the corner and the wheel is very straight, it never resists the rotation of the car, or it resists it very little. But the more angle you put, what you're doing is you're resisting the sort of rotation movement of the car. And you can imagine if your tires like this, it always wants to go straight. It never wants to rotate like this. And obviously toe-in affects acceleration grip as well. But I personally always like to find acceleration grip in some other way and then have a really low toe-in. And that way, what I can do is in the corners, the car rotates really nicely and doesn't sort of it doesn't resist the motion of the car. And when I'm accelerating, I have some other ways in the setup which I can produce more acceleration grip. And this is actually a really fun thing because you can see this yourself if you just take your car and go out in a field or even just on a track, but put a lot of towing into your car and then just go drive and then turn and brake at the same time, or do a really aggressive turning. You can see that the car turns in first, but then the towing starts to grab it and it goes back like this. So when you go into a corner and your car does like this motion and then starts to turn, that's when you know, like, the way you're driving the car, the towing is resisting the steering motion a lot. And especially in hairpins, you can see this, that a lot of times, especially on lower grips, a lot of cars do this, where they first shoot in the corner because the driver steers really aggressively, but the towing is fighting against the steering motion of the car.
Correct.
And this is why I personally really dislike having a lot of toe-in, because I really want the car to turn in as I turn in myself. So this is a really key thing.
Can we just make a point for people that don't know? When you've got a decent amount of rear towing, it actually makes the car go straight out of the corner. Because if you put a line, if you draw a line on the track and you've got the tires pointed in, the tires follow the line. So that's the basics of, it goes straight out of a corner. If you haven't got so much towing. Do you know if you got less towing, does them tires slide in the corner? Is that what happens? What they just
yeah, basically that's what happens, because if you can think of it this way: if your front wheels turn like this, and there's the contact patch that tries to make the car to turn. The same happens in the rear. So if your tires are straight, even then the tires slide a bit. The more towing angle in the car you have, the more the rear tires would have to slide to rotate the car, and they don't really want to slide, so they resist the sliding motion. But no
right.
matter what angle you have on the tires, they need to slide some amount to make the car steer around the corner. And the more towing you have, the more it's resisting it, and the more it sort of fighting the slide of the motion of the car. So basically, the less towing you have, the car slides a bit more. But if you have generated grips in the rear and other ways, the slide will be sort of in a way you don't notice it. But the car goes around the corner, always sliding a bit, no matter what you do about it.
Just go back to that question. The rear won't follow the front, or the rear's slower at following the front round the corner. How is we've dealt with the towing. How is the roll center affected with that?
Yeah, so especially if you have a very sort of imbalanced roll center in the rear, front and rear suspension. So if your rear sort of roll center is, for example, really high and the front end is really low, what happens is the front end is trying to roll really lazy, but the rear end wants to roll really fast. And because the car is one piece, it's one sort of body that's trying to move, it's a huge imbalance in the way the car rolls. And this can cause it where the front end leads the rear end too much, so the rear end just slides in the back, or it just that the rear end starts to push the front end, so the front end isn't at the same pace as the rear end. And that's why, because there's the roll axis which the car rolls around, which is sort of front roll center and rear roll center combined sort of into one axis. That's what the car tries to roll around. And if that axis is on a really weird angle, the car starts to roll really weirdly. And that's where you start to see these issues where the rear doesn't follow the front end, or the rear pushes the front end in the corners.
So, because I got a bit lost there, to be honest. So the front, let's talk about links, because that's what they're going to understand. Because then they've got to, once they start thinking counterintuitive, then they're going to understand, you know, a higher link is a lower roll center and a lower link is a higher. But that's, you know, somewhere down the line for some people. Some people are there. Okay. So let's talk about links. So in the front, if you've got a, just talk about links for a minute. If you've got a lower link in the front and a higher link at the back, it just rolls at two different speeds. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
So, well, obviously, there is an angle to the roll axis, and generally it's so that the front lower roll center is slightly higher than the rear. So you have more angle in the links in the front than you have in the rear, generally. Some people obviously drive differently. But that way what you will have is the front end geometry-wise will be stiff, and the rear end geometry-wise will be a bit softer. And this way, the front end is more direct. It follows your instructions as a driver better, because the geometry is doing more of the job. In the rear end, what you want is the rear end to be forgiving. So when you go into a corner, you want the car to turn into the corner, have the front end being stiff, links down. And then if there's a bump, which you might hit during the corner, usually the rear end hits the bumps much harder. And that's why you want to have the rear end geometry much more forgiving, having more forces go through the suspension and the car take out the bumps with the shocks instead of the arms, pushing on the arms. This is sort of a very basic.
That's a lot to understand.
Setup. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot to understand.
Yeah.
Okay. The next question. The higher roll center with more camber gain. Now we're getting into two adjustments here.
Yeah.
Can we just
So
hold on, because people won't know what camber gain is. Can you just, because that link, whether you
yeah.
change it down, can you just explain what camber gain is?
Yeah, so camber gain basically is because your tires are set up like this, but because if the links have some angle to them, and when you push the car down from the ride height, the links go like this, and now you can see like the
Correct.
gap between my fingers gets bigger, which means that the links actually need to go. When you push the car down, the links go like this. So what happens is the angle of the tire changes. So the tire, instead of standing up like this as it would be on your ride height, when you push the car down, the tire goes like this a bit. If your links are like this, the tire goes like this. So the links, the angle
So
of the
so
links
we hold
determines
on, hold
how.
on, hold on. So with a higher link, okay, your tires will go out,
Yeah, if it's
and
angled like this, because it goes down and it
yeah,
it pushes the tires out. But if your links are like parallel to the lower arm or close to being
yeah.
parallel to the lower arm, there's very little movement with the camber gain. There's very little camber gain at that point. But more angle on the link either way, you will have more camber gain. And this, like, moving the link also affects the roll center. So camber gain and roll center sort of you need to sometimes fight against each other to know like what you have. You sometimes you want to have more camber gain, but then you will want to have the links higher as well. So you need to find a way to compromise. But basically, what
Can
camber
you
gain is just the tires go in or out when the suspension is pressed down or up.
can you explain, because you want more, you want the tires to lean in more in the corner. So can you explain what you would do with a link? Because if as the tire goes into the corner, as the car rolls, the outside tire, naturally wants to go into the negative. Well,
Yeah.
that's, I mean, that's all right if you're on a really high grip track, but if you're not, can you just explain how the camber gain affects the car in the middle of the corner with the
Yeah. So pretty much every time you go into a corner, as the car rolls like this and the links roll like this, the tires will naturally do sort of this motion if there's nothing done to the car. But then when you have camber gain, the car rolls like this, which means the car is being pressed down. So now if you have a lot of camber gain, you have sort of this motion when the chassis is pressed down, and then roll motion does this, but the camber gain gives it back a little bit. So instead of going the corner and the car starts to roll and the tires follow the car, you have camber gain, which makes it that the car rolls like this, but the tires sort of step in like this. And this way, the
it
outer
stands?
tire stays stood up, which means that at the bottom of the tire, the contact patch stays bigger, which means that there will ultimately be
Correct,
much more grip.
correct. So with more camber gain, the tire doesn't go into the negative in the corner.
Yeah,
It stands up, and you get more. It stands up straight. You get more contact patch.
yeah. But there's I in one video I talked about camber gain quite a bit, and I personally run very little camber gain, and the reason behind this is even though I gain more grip in the corner, a lot of times I lose traction, forward traction while accelerating, because
Correct.
when the car squats in the rear, you have your tires go like this, and now you don't have the contact patch when you're accelerating. And that's why, as I already said before, when we talk about toe-in, I run a very little toe-in, which means that I don't have much grip in the rear because of the toe angles in the car, and I need to generate more grip whilst accelerating. And having very little camber gain is one way to generate grip while accelerating. So I've made a choice to have less camber gain, but then have toe-in, so I have more corner speed in the corners, which means that I don't have to push the car into the corner as much. Our dogs are
Right.
going a bit crazy. I don't know if
That's
you can
fine.
hear it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's fine. Uh, high grip roll. I think we covered. Did you? I think you covered that. Can you
Yeah,
just
it was about the
explain?
link pulling the car up, which is the high grip roller.
Yeah, yeah. So if you're on a
Yeah.
high traction, let's talk about our track. After 2 or 3 rounds, on a club day, Max, in the summer, when we're racing, we can get 100, kids, boys, girls. We got kids from 9, 8, 9, and some girls, a little bit older, all the way up to guys who are, 60, 65. I think some of them into the 70s. So we've got a large range of people. So we get like 100 people there,
Yeah.
and in the summer, the second or third round, there's a lot of traction. So can you just explain, how would you, if the car traction rolls, I mean, obviously you can lower the car, which lowers the center of gravity. But what can you do with a roll center?
Yeah.
Can you
So
explain?
so this fits really well into what we discussed before about putting the links down or putting the links up. And when I explained before, when the links are down and the car rolls, the link goes into an angle. And actually, a lot of the times, the issue of grip rolling isn't actually the height of the roll center, rather the angle of the link here, because of the force that's trying to pull it up. This is what makes the car grip roll really easily on higher grip. And oftentimes, the best thing to do on higher grip tracks is just to raise the link a bit, and then your car might be really good straight out the box, even if you normally practice on a lower grip track or your track gets higher on the grip. And that's one thing also is sometimes you don't have the grip rolling effect, but you have on higher grip tracks, oftentimes the car starts to scrub speed in the corner. So there's too much force pressing to the tire so that even though it doesn't grip roll, it starts to already scrub speed of the car. It wants to stop the car because there's so much sort of force on the tire. So when you raise the link,
That's
you
interesting.
lower the roll center, you sort of flow through the corner better because the car isn't just pushing to the ground as hard. So
Right.
that's one thing to keep in mind as well. That even though you're not struggling with grip rolling, oftentimes on higher grip, it's much better to run the links higher so you can have the car flow through the corner better.
Very
And
interesting.
yeah, and generally, like I want to say this now as we're talking about roll center again, is there's a lot of ways to tune the roll center. You can tune the height of the axle, it changes the roll center, the height of the hub normally, and the height of the link in a hub, the lower arm, the width of the arm pivots, the width of the upper arm, upper link, and the inside, and everything pretty much you can do that moves changes the roll center, apart from the shock position. And the upper links and why we've discussed it now here as well, why they are important part of the roll center is because they are sort of the most adjustable and easiest to adjust. And you can really feel the difference the best. Well, I would argue you feel the difference the most with the lower arm, but generally the lower arm settings are not that much adjusted. The upper link settings adjust the camber gain, they adjust the force that's pulling the link up, and they adjust roll center as well. So by changing this, you can really get a lot of things done to different grip levels, and oftentimes just knowing what to do with the upper link will help you a lot. And for example, as I said earlier, for higher grip, you want to go higher with the upper link. Sometimes what I do is I go higher with the lower arm. So I raise the arm up and then I raise the link up as well. So the
You're
difference between
talking
the lower
you're
arm,
talking four-wheel drive.
yes, but it works
Yeah,
as well
because
in two-wheel drive in the rear end. In the front end, it's a bit more tricky because of the high amount of kick up. But in rear end, the tool drive works the same way. Oftentimes in higher grip, I do go higher on the arm pivots and higher on the link, just to make the car sort of have the same flow roll characteristic of the car, but just to have less of the pulling force of the link.
yeah,
Yeah, but it gets really
typically,
complicated when talking all the aspects of the car. So the link is the easiest one to sort of understand and easiest one to work around when you're at the track. And it's not like there's no way to just tune your roll center. You tune a lot more things as well. So there's no setting in the car that just tunes only the roll center. No, it always tunes something else as well. And that's why, even though we're trying to simplify these topics, they are really sort of vast, and everything affects everything. So that's why it gets really complicated really easy. And it's the best to
Yeah.
keep it as simple as possible to sort of keep the understanding there. Even for me, even it's too complicated at the track to start thinking about what am I doing to my roll center, what am I doing to my camber gain. You have to sort of make some compromises and then just keep it as simple as possible so you can make the car work on the track as good as needed.
Yeah, I think high speed, the roll centers sometimes need adjusting, but typically I'm talking me now personally. I mean, if it's loose, we'll add washers to the rear, so we'll
Yeah.
raise the link up, lower the roll center, just to make it a little bit easier to drive. But if once the traction becomes high, or let's say medium in Australia, because most tracks are medium. There's 2 or 3 old tracks. There's Maitland, Keilor. I think there's one in North East Queensland. Once the traction comes up, medium, anything above medium to medium high, then we normally lower the link. Or if it's wet, if it's wet and damp, we raise the link. But if it's high, we lower it.
Yeah,
So
and
I was
the thing is that
so
what's happening
so
there obviously is when you lower the link, what you make is you take more out of the tire, you put more force in the tire, and because the roll center is higher that way when you lower the link. So
correct.
when the grip gets up, you lower the link. What you start to do is start to take more and more pressure off the tire because now the grip level is up. Now you can use the grip. But when the grip level goes even up from there, then you need to start because you have already enough grip to move the car around the track, or you need to start going faster. You need more power in your car, and then like your reflexes and everything starts to struggle. And that's why like carpet racing is really fast to drive, and you have to be really quick. So that's when you go like it's really it can feel a bit counterintuitive sometimes, but a lot of times when it's lower grip you can go up with the link, and that way you make the grip of the car. You drive the car on the same grip level all times. If it's really low grip and you go low with the link, what oftentimes happens is there's at some points there's a lot of grip, but then at sometimes you exceed it. So the car can be really snappy and have a sudden loss of grip. But then you obviously want to go higher with the link. Then when the grip comes up, you can use the traction available on the track and the friction available for the tire, and then you can go lower with the link, which will use more of force on the tire, which obviously will make the car have more grip and have a sort of a stiffer feel, and it will roll faster. And you won't have those snaps because now you have enough grip that you won't exceed it too easily. And then when the grip goes up again, now you start to having issues with sort of the car goes into the corner, it scrubs speed, or it pulls the link up, which pulls the car up. And when you start to have a grip as much as you have this way, generally this is only for high grip Astro or carpet, or in H scale some like really grippy tracks. Like now they have sugar tracks in Portugal at the IBCC.
Yeah, I've
Tracks
seen
like
that.
this,
Yeah,
yeah, you then want to go back up with the link now to calm down the roll to make it again really slow.
slow
So
it. Yeah,
there's sort of like ranges you need to know what to do. The ranges you need to know what to do in each range, grip range to the car, because in like for example road cars there isn't that crazy grip changes as there is in RC. If you think about it, you don't rally cars are close to it, but they pretty much have a different car for asphalt and for gravel. They have completely different suspensions on the cars, and that's the difference with RC because we have the same car and very different grip levels. And that's why some of these things might seem a bit counterintuitive that, for example, as you said, in tool drive, in lower grip, it most likely is a lot better to drive with the higher link when it's super low grip, because the car will be all the time on the same grip level. You won't have those snaps as easy.
Correct. Right, we'll have one more on roll centers, then you got your quiz questions. Be interesting to see how you go with your quiz question. Right, I've got 4 questions, but I'm just going to pick one. I'll pick one because it's our track, it's Keilor, and increasingly in Australia, the tracks are getting grippier. Very high grip, smooth track. What you do with the roll center, and I'll throw in what you do with the rear hub.
Yeah,
so very high grip, smooth.
So when it's high grip and smooth, you always want to go sort of higher with the roll center. That's my personal
So
preference.
that's a lower link.
So lower with the link, and that's why when you have bumps and ruts, it starts to catch the car a bit. That's why you can't utilize the lower link. But when you have a really smooth track, you can utilize the sort of stiffness of the geometry with the lower link and have much more grip that way. That's one of the key things I'd say. With the rear hub, sometimes having the hub higher can make it so that the car slides around a bit easier. But generally when it's smooth, I always like to have the hub really low. This is because that way you can have the maximum grip on the tire. And
correct.
The disadvantage of having the hub really low is that it catches bumps easier. But when it's smooth, you don't have that issue. So generally, when it's smooth, you go really low with the hubs. You have a higher roll center, and you can even have a bit stiffer spring and then a softer shock oil because you don't have bumps. So those are like the things that you can go towards when the track gets grippier and smoother, and you have a little bit of give. On AstroTurf, even if it's smooth AstroTurf, the AstroTurf sort of has sort of this, it catches it a bit. And the same happens with high grip dirt, which is sort of not smooth, but it's like a little bit like rumble. You have a little bit bounce on the car. Then you have to raise the hub. You have to go lower with the roll center. And there's a lot of things like, which we just said for smooth tracks, that you would go the opposite way to make the car have a bit more give and be a bit slower in the roll and have the rear hub higher, which gives you a little bit more give in the rear end, especially. Front end as well, but rear end is the most noticeable difference.
Right, well, because we've probably fried a few brain cells, but anyway. So your quiz questions, here we go. We'll give you the easier one first.
Okay.
Name the brand. You'll get this one. Name the brand of RC 1/8 buggy that has won the most, that's off-road. So let me say it again. So name the brand of 1/8 off-road buggy that has won the most world championships. You'll get this, it's easy.
Yeah, so obviously it's Kyosho, and I'd say MP9 is even the model that has the most. Could be like the early ones have a few more, but hard to say. But Kyosho has been a huge in 8 scale, and it's, I mean, 6 or 7 in a row in the 90s to 2000s. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, the other two are not so easy.
Yeah.
Who made? Now, I either want the name of the person or the company, but because you're European, you probably know this. So either the company or the name of the person. So who made the ball diff?
It was Schumacher, but I don't know who the person was.
Correct.
I believe Schumacher made it, but yeah, I don't know the person. I've never heard the name.
Ralph Schumacher.
Oh, okay. So he was the one who made it. Okay. But
Schumacher.
The late
Ralph.
Yeah, it's actually pretty crazy. We've often thought about with our friends about the fact that what if no one ever came up with a ball disc? Like two-wheel drive would have been undrivable for forever, really. Especially on like
Would have
dirt.
made a lot of, yeah. Right, this one's a little bit difficult. You're going to have to think about this. Name 3 Asian on-road world champions, whether it's electric or nitro, that have lived in Thailand or still live in Thailand. So 3, you got to name 3 Asian on-road world championships, whether it's nitro or electric, that either still live in Thailand or have lived in Thailand.
So Hara is one. That's
Correct.
that should be for sure.
Yep.
I don't know if Andy Moore lives in Thailand. He could be one.
No.
He isn't one. Okay. But okay, Hara is the one I know. Naoto could be one as well.
Correct.
And
Who?
Naoto Machigura.
Who? No, he's Japanese.
Yeah, but I think he might have not lived in Thailand, but he also races a lot in Thailand.
If I'll give you a clue, you've got to go back to the race, and I'll name a guy who was in the race, Barry Baker.
Barry Baker was in the race. This is old, man.
The guy who beat him done that very famous. They were coming to the S bend, and Barry Baker slowed down to take the S, but this guy just went straight through. It was a very famous pass in the history of on-road racing. It's still on YouTube. And the car.
I need to. I might have seen it, but I can't. But I have to check that out. That sounds
okay. Well, that guy was named Sirakan.
Okay. Yeah.
And he owns a racetrack in Thailand called not RC Addict. It's the. It'll come to me in a minute. Yeah, Sirakan won the Worlds in, I don't know, somewhere in the US. But when Barry Baker was in his prime, he slowed down to do the S. Sirakan just went straight through. You missed him by about that much. And then you got the corner. He just went straight through. Bing! And he won the Worlds. His second name is about 16, 17 letters long. It's too difficult to... Now, but who's the other guy? Who's the other? Asian. I'll give you a top. He's an Asian.
Oh, yeah, Asian.
He's from Thailand. He's Thai. That'll give you... He's absolutely 100% Thai. And he won the Worlds in Thailand. And it was nitro on-road. And he won it at RC Addict. Can't give you any...
Yeah, I remember. It was... what was his name? I think he ran for Maxima for a long time. Vaytrack or something.
Correct. Mean Verdex.
Yeah, I remember that race. Okay, yeah.
But I don't think if I'd give you them tips, I don't think you would have got it.
Yeah, I would have only gotten Ashushi. He's the only one I know. Yeah. Yeah, I was trying to get Andy Moore, but you said Asian, but I think Andy Moore lives in Thailand, right?
He did win the Worlds. Win the Worlds.
But he's British.
Yeah. I don't think he's ever lived. He's raced a lot in Thailand, but there's a few guys that have lived in Thailand. But anyway, look, Max, because we've been on this a while. Yeah. It's been absolutely fascinating. Digging into your. Yeah, it's been good. So anyway, thanks a lot. And I mean, look, I haven't done this for fame or fortune. I've just done it because we just locked down. I mean, Australia's about 15 million people, like I say, locked down. So we've got a lot of time on our hands. But it's been great having you. And there's a lot more. There was a lot more questions, but we just got so wrapped up in understanding the roll centers.
There's enough to talk for days about RC cars. Especially some.
Yeah. Anyway, stay safe, and
you too.
We'll catch you another time, probably in the future.
Yeah, it was fun. All right.
Okay. Right. All the best. Thanks, buddy.
Yep. You too.